To Gavin Stone, a building was not a static block of concrete forced upon the earth. It was a living organism that needed to breathe, in the quiet, misty valley of Blackwood Ridge. And Gavin stood atop the exposed timber scaffolding of the old mill restoration project. He wore a faded canvas jacket, a leather tool belt slung across his hips, and his dark hair was lightly dusted with cedar shavings. Below him, the rushing river roared through the stone archways built 2 centuries ago. Gavin didn't use power drills or steel bolts for the primary joints. Instead, he knelt down on the damp oak beam, his calloused fingers tracing the precise hand-carved mortise and tenon joint. He gently tapped a dense white oak peg into the timber with a wooden mallet. Thump, thump. The joinery locked together seamlessly, designed to expand with moisture and contract with heat, bending with the valley's natural tremors rather than snapping under stress. You're building a temple for squirrels, Gavin, while the rest of the city builds an empire. Vivian's voice drifted up from the stone embankment below, and she stepped carefully over the gravel path, her high heels entirely out of place against the mud. She wore a pristine tailored cream trench coat, shielding her eyes from the light rain with an expensive silk umbrella. And Gavin wiped a line of rain from his forehead and smiled down at his wife. The river built this foundation 200 years ago, Vivian. If we respect its path, this timber structure will outlast us all. And respect doesn't pay the property taxes on the city gallery, Gavin, Vivian said, ascending the wooden steps with deliberate, cold grace. She handed him a thick leather portfolio bound in silver foil. And Damien and I just finished the preliminary board meeting for the Ridge Development Project. The city council wants to pave over the northern wetland basin, and they're offering us $50 million to design a luxury glass and concrete high-rise complex. Gavin's smile faded. He set his wooden mallet down on the oak beam and took the portfolio, turning the glossy pages. And the blueprints inside were horrific. Massive concrete pylons driven deep into the riverbed, blocking the natural subterranean water channels and sealing the entire wetland under millions of tons of asphalt. "This is madness, Vivian," and Gavin said, his low voice tight with concern. "The northern wetland is the valley's natural sponge. If you anchor concrete pylons into that shale shelf, the groundwater won't drain during the monsoon season, and the pressure will build up behind the ridge until the entire hillside slumps into the river. Damien's structural engineers said the soil is completely stable," Vivian countered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And we don't need your timber lectures, Gavin. We need your stamp. The city requires the signature of the lead heritage architect to approve the zoning variance. Then tell Damien to find another architect," Gavin said softly, and closing the portfolio and handing it back. "My name will not be stamped on a blueprint that buries this valley in concrete." Vivian stared at him, her jaw clenching tightly. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by an icy and calculated distance that made the rain feel warm by comparison. "You always were a stubborn fool, Gavin," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring river below. "You think you're a guardian of the earth, but you're just an obstacle standing in the way of our future." She turned and walked down the scaffolding without another word. Gavin watched her go, a heavy, unsettling dread settling deep in his chest. And he didn't see Damien standing near the black SUV parked at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting, and holding a rolled-up set of revised engineering schematics in his gloved hands. The storm hit Blackwood Ridge shortly after midnight, and rain lashed against the glass windows of the Valley Site Office, where Gavin sat late into the night reviewing the river's historical flood markers. A sharp, metallic screech echoed from the direction of the riverbank, and followed by a sickening thud that vibrated straight through the floorboards. Gavin bolted upright. Grabbing his heavy oilskin coat and flashlight, he sprinted out into the downpour. The rain was torrential, and turning the access roads into rivers of red clay. As he neared the old mill restoration site, the beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a nightmare. And the massive timber archway he had secured earlier that afternoon had partially collapsed into the river. But it hadn't failed because of the wood or the water pressure. Gavin scrambled down the muddy embankment, and his boots sinking into the silt. When he shone his flashlight onto the structural support beams, his breath hitched. The hand-carved mortise and tenon timber joints had been removed. In their place, cheap and structural steel brackets had been hastily bolted into the wet oak, steel brackets that had sheared clean under the weight of the rain, tearing the ancient wood apart like paper. "Gavin!" Footsteps squelched through the mud behind him, and Damien stood at the top of the ridge, surrounded by 3 private site inspectors and 2 city police officers. Damien was wearing a bright yellow hard hat over his expensive coat, his face a mask of feigned horror and theatrical panic. "And I told you the timber design wasn't safe," Damien shouted to the officers, pointing a trembling finger down at Gavin. He insisted on using outdated, unsafe methods to cut costs. And 3 night shift workers were under that archway when it collapsed. Gavin's heart dropped into an abyss. "What are you talking about, Damien? No workers were scheduled for tonight. And who replaced the timber joinery with steel? And we have the site logs, Gavin," Damien countered, stepping down the slope accompanied by the officers. "You signed off on the structural revisions 4 hours ago. And you authorized the cheap steel brackets to meet the deadline because you couldn't afford the hand-carved timber work." "That's a lie," Gavin roared, his low voice breaking through the sound of the storm. "And I would never put steel into green oak. It corrodes the timber. Save it for the magistrate, Mr. Stone," the lead officer said, stepping forward with handcuffs drawn. "1 worker is severely injured, and 2 others are trapped in the debris downstream. You're under arrest for gross negligence and corporate manslaughter." Gavin reached into his coat pocket for his site journal to prove the original specifications, but his pocket was empty. He looked up at the ridge. Standing next to the police vehicle, shielded under a large umbrella, was Vivian. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. In her gloved hand, she held Gavin's leather-bound site journal and slowly slipping it into her trench coat pocket. She met Gavin's gaze through the driving rain, her expression utterly cold and devoid of remorse. As the steel handcuffs clicked around Gavin's wrists, he realized the terrifying truth. And the collapse wasn't an accident. They had sabotaged his work, altered his blueprints, and sacrificed human lives, all to frame him, strip him of his license, and clear the way for their concrete empire. And the rain washed over Gavin's face as they forced him into the back of the police cruiser, leaving his life's work broken in the mud behind him. The courtroom in the district capital felt colder than the rain at Blackwood Ridge, and Gavin sat at the defense table in a muted gray suit that hung loosely on his broad frame. 6 weeks of pretrial detention had carved sharp hollows beneath his cheekbones, but his eyes remained steady and clear. Across the aisle sat Damien, and dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit, his face contorted into a masterful display of somber grief. Next to him sat Vivian, and wearing a pristine black dress with a modest pearl necklace, the picture of a heartbroken wife forced to fulfill her civic duty. "The evidence presented by the prosecution is damning," the judge announced, and his voice reverberating through the cavernous room. The site logs, bearing the digital signature of Gavin Stone, clearly authorized the installation of substandard steel brackets to bypass municipal safety delays. Furthermore, the expert testimony of Mr. Damien Stone confirms that the defendant ignored repeated warnings regarding structural instability. Gavin's attorney stood up, but his defense was limp and compromised by missing site records and forged digital receipts that Gavin had never seen. "Your Honor," Gavin's attorney began weakly, and "my client maintains that his physical site journal was stolen and that the digital authorization logs were created without his consent. A site journal that has conveniently disappeared," the judge interrupted dryly, "and while 3 families suffer the catastrophic consequences of a collapsed archway." The judge turned his stern gaze to Gavin. "Gavin Stone, your reckless disregard for foundational engineering principles resulted in severe injury and destruction of historical land and the tragic death of site worker Thomas Vance. This court finds you guilty of gross criminal negligence and involuntary manslaughter." The gavel came down with a sharp, heavy thud, and in accordance with the civil liability claims filed by Blackwood Development Holdings, the judge continued, "Your architectural license is revoked indefinitely. All personal and corporate assets, and including your holding shares in the Blackwood Ridge Land Trust, are forfeited to cover restitution costs and environmental cleanup." Vivian did not smile. She simply lowered her head and, dabbing delicately at her eye with a lace handkerchief, a performance designed for the journalists scribbling frantically in the front row. Beside her, Damien leaned back, a faint, imperceptible curl of victory at the corner of his mouth. And 3 hours later, in the visitor holding room, Vivian stepped through the heavy steel door alone. She set her leather handbag on the metal table, the click of her designer heels echoing against the bare walls. And "The appeal won't go through, Gavin," she said softly, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. "Damien has already secured the zoning variance from the city council. The wetland basin will be drained by the end of the month." And Gavin looked down at his hands, raw and unadorned without his wedding ring, which had been surrendered during processing. "You sacrificed Thomas Vance for a slab of concrete, Vivian? You knew those brackets wouldn't hold wet oak." And "Thomas Vance was an acceptable casualty for a $50 million buyout," Vivian replied without flinching. "You were always too romantic for this world, Gavin. You wanted to build things that last forever. But you forgot that the people living in them want money today." She leaned closer across the table, her shadow blocking the harsh overhead light. "You have 5 years of probation and 0 assets. The house, the land, and the name, it all belongs to Damien and me now. Stay in the city, Gavin. Don't come back to the ridge." She turned and walked out, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind her. Gavin remained seated in the quiet room, and his lungs drawing in the stale, artificial air. They had taken his license, his land, and his reputation. But as he closed his eyes, he could still feel the exact grain of the oak, the pressure of the river, and the ancient geology of the valley. They thought they had buried him in paper. They didn't realize they had just stripped away everything that kept him from fighting back. 8 months after the gavel struck the bench, and Blackwood Ridge was no longer green, where ancient elderberry trees and weeping willows once drank from the northern wetland. Massive diesel earth movers now roared. The tranquil valley basin had been gouged into a muddy, barren crater, and yellow warning tape fluttered in the wind around towering concrete pillars, Damien's foundation pylons, driven deep into the earth to support the high-rise luxury complex. A mile downstream, and hidden within the dense pine canopy overlooking the valley, stood an old timber cabin. It belonged to Leo, the veteran master carpenter who had spent 40 years shaping timber alongside Gavin's father. Inside the dimly lit cabin, and blue paper schematics were pinned across every wooden wall. Gavin stood over a long pine workbench illuminated by a single oil lamp. He wore a worn canvas jacket, his hair longer, his face leaner and lined with quiet intensity. "And they're driving the pylon straight into the blue shale shelf, Gavin," Leo said, setting 2 tin mugs of hot tea onto the workbench. "I walked the ridgeline last night. The ground is trembling 3 miles out, and the water from the northern aquifer has nowhere to go. It's trapped behind those concrete walls." Gavin leaned over a large topographical map of the valley floor, and tracing a red line along the subterranean fault lines with his calloused thumb. "Damien thinks concrete is invincible," Gavin said, his low baritone voice steady and cold. "He filled the surface with cement, but he didn't drain the deep water pocket beneath the shale. The monsoon season starts in 4 weeks. When 40 inches of rain hits this ridge, the water pressure behind that concrete barrier will reach critical mass, and the earth will push back," Leo murmured, his eyes grim. "It won't just push back. It will liquefy the clay beneath the high-rise foundation," Gavin corrected, tapping a specific point on the map. And Damien's engineers bypassed the hydrostatic pressure testing to save $12 million. When that water pocket bursts, it won't just sink his construction site. It will slide the entire western hillside into the river, and destroying the historic lower township. The door of the cabin creaked open, letting in a swirl of pine-scented mist. A young man stepped inside, shaking the damp rain from his coat. It was Thomas Vance's younger brother, Eli. And "I brought the site blueprints from Damien's office, Gavin," Eli said, setting a roll of stolen engineering schematics onto the table. "Damien is rushing the pouring process, and he's doubling the concrete shifts because the investors are threatening to back out if the foundation isn't set before the gala next month." Gavin unrolled the schematics, examining Damien's structural calculations. A cold and sardonic smile touched his lips. He shortened the curing time of the lower footings from 28 days to 7, Gavin said softly, analyzing the numbers. He's pouring raw concrete over wet, expanding shale. And he isn't building a luxury complex, Eli. He's building an underground dam with a timer attached to it. What do we do? Eli asked, his hands clenching into fists. They killed my brother and blamed you. And we can't let them destroy the whole valley. Gavin rolled up the schematics, his eyes reflecting the warm orange light of the oil lamp. The pain of the courtroom betrayal had settled into something immovable, a deep, unshakable resolve. And we don't attack his building, Eli, Gavin said quietly. We let the rain expose his arrogance, but before the storm hits, we are going to build a secret water diversion channel along the old riverbed. When his concrete barrier fails, and our channel will save the lower township and trap Damien and Vivian inside their own collapse. Gavin picked up his heavy timber chisel, testing its razor-sharp edge with his thumb, and the ghost of Blackwood Ridge was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was preparing to rewrite the blueprint of the valley. The northern ridge of the valley was swallowed by a thick, freezing fog that clung to the damp bark of the pines. And for 3 weeks, while diesel generators thundered down in the muddy basin, where Damien's crews worked double shifts, a quiet, hand-powered construction project took place 200 feet above them in the shadows of the forest. And Gavin stood at the edge of the abandoned logging ditch, his linen shirt soaked through with cold sweat. He didn't use heavy machinery. The roar of an engine would alert Damien's private security guards patrolling the perimeter road. And instead, Gavin, Leo, and Eli worked with hand shovels, picks, and heavy wooden sleds. The soil here is dense clay over granite, Leo panted, driving an iron pick into the earth. He wiped his brow with a muddy forearm. And if we clear another 50 yards down to the old dry creek bed, the slope will carry the overflow straight into the stone canyon away from the lower township. We need it deeper, Leo, Gavin said, and his voice low and steady as he hauled a sled filled with shattered stone. When the main shale shelf shifts under Damien's foundation, it won't just be water rushing out. It will be thousands of tons of liquefied mud and raw gravel. And if this channel isn't lined with timber cribbing, the walls will collapse and redirect the surge right back toward the town. Ely rolled a heavy, hand-cleaved oak log to the edge of the trench. And the timber cribbing is held together with mortise and tenon joints, just like the old mill? Exactly, Gavin replied, kneeling down in the mud to examine the joint fitting. And he took a heavy wooden mallet and tapped a white oak peg deep into the interlocking beams. Thump, thump. Concrete cracks under shifting weight because it's rigid. Interlocking timber flexes. When the hillside begins to slide, and these oak frames will expand under the pressure of the earth, holding the diversion channel open while the water drains safely into the canyon. Ellie looked down toward the valley basin, and where blinding stadium floodlights illuminated Damien's sight through the fog. The massive concrete footings for the luxury high-rise complex looked like giant gray gravestones rising out of the gouged earth. And they're pouring the 5th tier of the foundation tonight, Eli said, his voice tight with anger. I saw Damien on the news this afternoon, boasting that the Blackwood Ridge Plaza will be the safest, most modern structure in the state. And Gavin didn't look down at the lights. He picked up his chisel, meticulously carving the notch of the next support beam. Damien is building a monument to his own vanity, Eli, Gavin said quietly. And he thinks because he covered the earth in cement, he owns it. But nature doesn't care about press releases or corporate investors. The water is already rising behind his western retaining wall. And I can hear the shale groaning under the pressure every time the temperature drops at night. Leo paused, leaning on his shovel as he looked at Gavin. What happens when the storm hits and the channel takes the surge? And Vivian and Damien will know someone built this. Let them know, Gavin said, his dark eyes reflecting the faint moonlight breaking through the mist. By the time the water hits this trench, and their concrete empire will already be at the bottom of the river. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the dark peaks to the north. The first heavy droplets of the autumn monsoon began to fall, and tapping against the canopy of leaves above them, Gavin looked up into the dark sky, his jaw set like iron. The storm had finally arrived, Chapter 3, the diversion Part 2, the cracks in the glass down in the valley, and Inside the glass-walled VIP pavilion, overlooking the construction zone, the atmosphere was thick with expensive champagne and nervous tension. Damien stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a crystal glass, and his eyes fixed on the rain lashing against the glass. Outside, heavy yellow spotlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the massive concrete foundation tier. The rain was torrential, falling in relentless, and heavy sheets that turned the surrounding dirt slopes into churning torrents of brown mud. "You look tense, Damien," Vivian said, stepping up beside him. She wore an ivory silk gown, and her diamond bracelet catching the ambient glow of the chandeliers. "The city council members are thrilled. The mayor just praised our efficiency in his toast." The water table in the western sensor pit jumped 3 feet in the last hour, and Damien muttered under his breath, taking a sharp sip of his drink. "The pumps on the lower deck are running at maximum capacity." Vivian's smile tightened slightly, though her eyes remained cold and composed. "And the pumps are doing their job. That's why we paid for them. Don't let your nerves ruin tonight." The final investment round closes at midnight. Suddenly, a dull, deep shudder vibrated through the reinforced floorboards beneath their feet. And it wasn't the sharp crack of thunder. It was a low, guttural groan that seemed to rise from deep within the earth itself. On the cocktail tables around the room, liquid inside fragile crystal flutes rippled in synchronized rings, and several city council members paused mid-conversation, looking around in mild confusion. "Just the site generators settling under the load," Damien announced loudly, forcing a charismatic smile as he turned to the room. "And nothing to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. We've anchored this complex straight into the granite bedrock." As the guests chuckled and returned to their conversations, Damien caught the arm of his chief site engineer, and who had just rushed into the pavilion, soaked to the bone and pale as a sheet. "What was that?" Damien hissed, dragging the engineer into a curtained alcove. "It's the shale shelf on the North Ridge, sir," the engineer whispered, and his voice trembling violently. "The water pressure behind the concrete retaining wall has exceeded our maximum safety estimates by 40%. The soil beneath the lower footings is turning to liquid slurry, and the concrete isn't holding, it's bowing." Vivian stepped into the alcove, her silk dress rustling against the velvet curtain. "Then reinforce it. Pour more quickset cement into the drainage gap." "We can't, Mrs. Stone." And the engineer gasped, looking at her as if she were insane. "The drainage gap was sealed off 8 months ago when you altered the blueprints to expand the underground parking garage. There is nowhere for the water to go, and the pressure is building like a hydraulic bomb behind the main wall." Before Damien could respond, a deafening sound, like a cannon shot echoing through a canyon, shattered the night outside, through the glass windows of the pavilion, and everyone watched in utter horror as a 50-foot section of the reinforced concrete retaining wall cracked open. A massive, white-hot spray of pressurized water and shattered stone exploded outward, and followed instantly by a terrifying wave of liquefied mud and boulders cascading down from the upper ridge. The VIP guests screamed, abandoning their drinks as panic erupted inside the pavilion. Damien backed away from the window, and his champagne glass slipping from his numb fingers and shattering on the floor. Through the blinding rain and the churning chaos of the mudslide below, and his eyes caught something on the upper ridge line, something that made his blood run cold. High above the collapsing concrete site, illuminated by a flash of jagged lightning, stood a solitary figure atop a massive and interlocking timber barrier. He was unmoving, holding a heavy timber staff against the storm, directing the roaring surge of mud away from the town and straight into the newly carved diversion channel. It was Gavin Stone, and the ghost they had buried in paper had returned, not with a lawsuit, but with the undeniable power of the earth itself. The morning sun broke through the remaining storm clouds, casting a harsh and unforgiving light over the wreckage of Blackwood Ridge, where Damien's multi-million-dollar concrete foundation had stood 12 hours prior. There was now a vast, gaping scar of torn earth, cracked cement blocks, and twisted steel rebar. And millions of tons of liquefied mud had swept through the lower construction zone, burying heavy diesel excavators like toys in a sandbox. Yet, less than a quarter-mile downstream, the historic lower township remained completely untouched. And The roaring torrent of mud and water had been intercepted by the timber diversion channel on the upper ridge. Gavin's hand-carved oak cribbing had absorbed the massive hydraulic shock, flexing under the immense load without snapping, and guiding the deadly mudslide safely into the uninhabited stone canyon. By 8 a.m., the site was swarming, with state emergency response teams, environmental inspectors, and dozens of news crews broadcasting live across the country. Damien stood near the edge of the access road, his expensive suit covered in splatters of dried mud, his hair disheveled. Beside him, Vivian sat in the back of a luxury SUV, her face pale, staring blankly through the tinted window. The structural failure was catastrophic, Mr. Stone, the chief state inspector said, adjusting his hard hat as he approached Damien with a digital clipboard. Your retaining wall didn't just fail, it detonated under hydrostatic pressure, and you sealed off the natural drainage channels, trapping millions of gallons of groundwater behind raw concrete. It was an unprecedented weather event, Damien stammered, his voice thin and shrill, and no engineering design could have anticipated 40 inches of rainfall. Your brother's original designs did, the inspector replied coldly, pulling up a file on his tablet. And we just reviewed the original 2024 environmental impact assessment submitted by Gavin Stone before his license was revoked. And his blueprints explicitly mapped this exact subterranean water pocket and called for an open timber and stone drainage canal. The inspector pointed up toward the northern ridge, where the towering oak timber channel stood solid, and holding back thousands of tons of diverted mud. In fact, the inspector continued, his eyes narrowing at Damien, someone built a handcrafted timber diversion channel up on the ridge last night, and if that structure hadn't been there to catch the surge when your wall blew, the entire lower township would be buried under 10 feet of mud right now, and whoever built that timber canal saved hundreds of lives and proved that your concrete design was an absolute death trap. A fleet of black sedans pulled up to the perimeter tape, and state prosecutors and investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit stepped out, badges hanging around their necks. Damien took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. What is this? Damien Stone and Vivian Stone? And the lead prosecutor asked, pulling a stack of warrants from his leather briefcase. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, falsification of public safety documents, environmental destruction, and reckless endangerment. And the site logs from 2024 have been recovered from an encrypted secondary server, proving you forged Gavin Stone's signature to bypass municipal safety inspections. 2 state troopers stepped forward, and pulling Damien's arms behind his back and clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, Vivian stepped out of the SUV, her hands trembling as she held out her wrists to the officers. Her cool and untouchable facade had completely disintegrated. As the troopers led her away, her eyes drifted toward the upper ridge. Standing at the edge of the forest, surrounded by his loyal crew and holding his wooden staff, stood Gavin. And he didn't smile, he didn't celebrate. He simply watched the sirens flash against the ruin of their greed, a quiet testament to a truth the earth had known all along. What is built on lies will always crumble, but what is built on honor will endure. 1 year later, the scarred earth of Blackwood Ridge had begun to heal. Where Damien's concrete crater once stood, the city council, under strict new environmental oversight, had mandated a complete land restoration project. The subterranean water channels were reopened, allowing the northern aquifer to flow naturally into a series of stepped stone basins and terraced wetlands. High on the northern slope, overlooking the lush green valley, stood the newly completed Stone Heritage Crafts Institute, it was not a towering mass of glass or steel. Built entirely from locally harvested oak, pine, and river stone, the institute blended seamlessly into the surrounding forest. The main pavilion utilized hand-carved mortise and tenon timber framing, designed to flex with the earth's natural tremors and breathe with the seasonal humidity. Gavin Stone stood on the open wooden terrace of the institute, wearing his worn leather tool belt over a simple canvas shirt. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of damp pine sap and blooming elderberry flowers. In his hands, he held a newly issued, gold-embossed credential, Master Heritage Architect and Chief Environmental Restoration Officer. The state licensing board had not only fully reinstated his credentials, but had also established his timber framing methods as the official safety standard for all watershed development. "The afternoon apprentices have arrived, Gavin," Leo said, stepping onto the terrace with 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He set one down on the timber railing. 30 young architects from across the country. They all want to learn how to join wood without steel bolts. Gavin smiled warmly, taking a sip of the coffee. "Make sure they start with the shovels first, Leo. If they don't understand the dirt beneath their boots, they'll never understand the timber in their hands." "What about the court finality?" Leo asked softly, leaning against the railing. "It was finalized yesterday," Gavin replied, looking out over the quiet valley. "Damien received 12 years for corporate manslaughter and environmental fraud. Vivian was sentenced to 8 for conspiracy and falsification of evidence. The Blackwood Ridge Holdings Company has been liquidated to fund the valley's perpetual ecological trust." There was no bitterness in Gavin's voice, only the profound, quiet peace of a craftsman whose work had survived the storm. He had watched the people who tried to destroy him turn on each other in court, their wealth and influence crumbling the moment they lost their hold on the narrative. They had sought to conquer the valley with concrete, only to be buried by the very earth they held in contempt. A young man walked onto the terrace, carrying a leather-bound sketchbook and a wooden mallet. It was Eli Vance. He looked confident, his hands calloused from months of working the timber alongside Gavin. "The foundation beams for the lower workshop are set, Gavin," Eli said, his eyes shining with pride. "We checked the moisture content of the white oak. It's down to 12%. The joinery is locking in tight." "Good," Gavin said, setting his mug down and picking up his timber chisel. "Let's go take a look." As Gavin walked down the timber steps toward the workshop, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, bathing the wooden structure in a rich, golden light. The river below roared its ancient song, flowing freely through the stone archways. Gavin's stone was no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows of the forest. He was the anchor of the valley, building a legacy that would stand long after the concrete had turned back to dust.